Welcome back to GBN America. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg. America's initial position at the UN was that Israel has the right to defend itself, so much so that Washington has twice vetoed council resolutions for a ceasefire in Gaza since the Hamas terror attack on October the 7th. However, the Biden administration's shift in stance towards Israel's planned invasion of Rafah has the world talking. We're joined now, and I'm very pleased we're joined now, by John Hanna, who has served in senior foreign policy positions for both Democratic and Republican administrations. Mr. Hanna, what do you think prompted the Biden administration's shift in stance towards Israel's planned invasion of Rafah?
Well, first, thanks for having me, Sir Jacob. Listen, the Biden administration now for over 4 months, its support for Israel, I think, has been really quite magnificent and admirable, although I think it's clear now that the resolve to back Israel is eroding. And it's hard not to come to the conclusion that it has an awful lot to do with the president's own domestic politics as we approach our elections this November, that he has a very activist and loud wing of the Democratic base, the progressive base, that almost from the beginning has been extremely opposed to his position of unequivocal support for Israel after this near genocidal terrorist attack of October the 7th, that Israel has the right, has the responsibility, has the absolute duty to see Hamas not only destroyed as a military organization, but to have that Hamas regime, its governance in Gaza, eliminated as well.
And this is fundamental, isn't it, that Hamas must be destroyed, and that Rafah is the crucial conduit for arms coming in, for smuggling that Hamas has been able to use, then to have the munitions it needs to attack Israel. So if Rafah were to be left alone, then Israel's security couldn't be guaranteed.
I think you're absolutely right that unless you go to Rafah, unless you take Rafah, unless you eliminate Hamas's control of the Egypt-Gaza border, you will not succeed in the mission of destroying Hamas. Rafah is the lung through which the Hamas army breathes. It's the critical node and smuggling point through which Iran has been able to provide Hamas with extraordinary military capabilities over the last 10 to 15 years. Unless Israel goes to Rafah, which is going to be, admittedly, a very, very difficult operation, and it is important that the IDF prepare carefully for that. There are over now 1 million displaced Palestinians on that border that need to be moved away as much as possible. There are concerns out of Egypt. They clearly don't want Palestinians running into the Sinai. That's a different issue, a discussion for another day, Egypt's role in all of this. But if you don't allow Israel to go to Rafah, you are essentially saying Hamas wins and Israel loses, with extraordinary implications and ramifications for not only Israel and the Middle East going forward, but I think for the interests of the entire West and the entire civilized world.
Well, you see, I think that's the fundamental point, that the civilized world, the West, doesn't have the stomach for the fight, does it? That it was so strongly in support of Israel immediately after these horrific, as you said, near genocidal attacks, but that it doesn't like the fact that war is a messy, unpleasant, brutal business, and that to win a war, you have to use the means of war. And so as Israel's done that, support for Israel has reduced not just in the United States, but in other Western countries.
I think there's an awful lot to what you say, Sir Jacob. I mean, the fact that this war has gone on for 4 months, frankly, as somebody who worked in the U.S. government for almost 20 years, went through the 2006 war with Hezbollah during the Bush 43 administration. That war lasted, I think, all of 34 days that we gave Israel before the pressure globally, internationally, domestically to try and impose a ceasefire, to end the fighting, to end the images on our TV sets just became overwhelming. The fact that we've allowed this to go on for 4 months, frankly, I found surprising. I'm very glad and heartened by it, and obviously the scale and scope of just how awful the massacres and atrocities of 10/7 play into that. But I do agree with you that we are now, through a combination of international pressures and domestic pressures that different players are feeling, including here in the United States, we're now putting this kind of pressure on Israel. And my hope is that Israel knows what it needs to do. I think the Israeli people are unified that they cannot allow Hamas to continue to exist on that border. If Israel and the Zionist promise and enterprise are to be vindicated and to carry through, they've got to see this war through to the end.
And you're one of the most experienced people in foreign policy, not just in the United States, but in the world. Isn't one of the real difficulties of foreign policy is that it becomes dominated by a 24-hour news agenda when successful foreign policy is very long-term? And the long-term benefit of Hamas being defeated is enormous, but the short-term cost of pictures on our television screens that people can't face is becoming too high for democratic politicians.
That certainly seems to be the case, and that is unquestionably the calculations that Hamas, Iran, and all of our enemies make when they start out on these genocidal ventures, is that they are betting that, in fact, over time, our attention will be diverted by the pictures appearing on Al Jazeera, on TikTok, on our Telegram social media feeds, dominated, of course, by platforms loyal to the Muslim Brotherhood, toward the Iranians, toward the progressive left, that those will put sufficient pressure that the West, we will lose our breath. We will beg for short-term relief and mercy, and at the expense of a long-term price that will be paid down the road and in much more higher cost in blood and treasure.
Well, John Hannah, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with GBN America viewers today. Thank you. Well, welcome back to GBN America. I am so excited to be able to introduce Ian Samuel this afternoon, the Senior Assistant Counsel at Altria, to talk about one of my favourite subjects, that is the American Constitution. I like talking about the British Constitution too, as it seems to me they are the two most beautifully constructed constitutions in the world. But both of them face their challenges. So, Mr. Samuel, if I can start with one of the big challenges for the US Constitution, which is that it's so difficult to change, and there have been so few changes in its 240 years nearly history.
Yes, I would say that is its principal difficulty and its principal defect as compared to the Constitution of the United Kingdom. In the United Kingdom, the fundamental laws can be changed the way that all laws are changed because Parliament with the King is supreme. In the United States, it doesn't work that way. Even if overwhelming majorities of the country, bipartisan majorities of the country, want the Constitution changed in some respect, it is often impossible to do so because For one thing, supermajorities of both houses of Congress are required to propose amendments to the Constitution. And then ratifications must be separately enacted by 3/4 of each of our 50 states, often within a certain amount of time. So that, an amendment could have an expiration date of a few years. And even if the subject matter of the constitutional amendment at issue is quite popular or quite necessary or utterly desirable, then these things can sometimes be impossible simply because of the amount of procedural overhead associated with them. On top of that, there are certain provisions of the Constitution which are sort of by their terms unamendable. If you've ever thought that the United States' Senate procedures, where every state, no matter its size, gets an equal representation in one of the two houses of Congress, is strange, you're not alone. But that provision is essentially by its terms unamendable. So we're essentially stuck with it unless we'd like to start over from nothing.
But isn't that one of the advantages of the US Constitution, as opposed to the UK Constitution, that a government with a majority of one in the UK can change the fundamental basis of our Constitution? So the flexibility can lead to instability, whereas the US has fantastic stability, and it's become the richest country in the world. It's worked.
That is the argument, right? The argument is that these multiple veto points, and the same thing is true, by the way, for domestic legislation. It's harder to pass domestic legislation, and there are more avenues for it to be reviewed, invalidated in the courts, and so on. The argument is that by making any action difficult, it preserves a sort of stability. The problem is that it's only true if you think that inaction always guarantees stability, which is true over short periods, but not over long periods. When we have election campaigns in the United States, for example, everybody understands that what the political parties say that they will do should not be taken seriously. They may represent general expressions of values. They may even represent, in rare cases, things that have some relationship to legislation that will eventually pass. But when we conduct our election campaigns, everybody knows that absent the most overwhelming majorities, nothing like what the parties say they would like to do, either in domestic legislation and certainly not in the constitutional arena, will actually happen. In the United Kingdom, that is not true. People can take seriously the political programs of the parties for office. When you have general election campaigns, people actually read these manifestos, and they're important. That it's not like that it is in the United States. And so these multiple veto points, and this is all the more true for constitutional amendments as for domestic legislation, although I think the issues are common to both, these make it so that the fundamental law and the domestic law, the more ordinary law, cannot change in response to externally imposed instability. And so you are stuck with a situation where you cannot react or respond to external circumstances, and that too is a source of instability over the longer term.
I see that it can be, and I see that gridlock has its disadvantages, but the great presidents, so who am I thinking of in the last century? Well, FDR, not necessarily a great president, but amazing reformer, Lyndon B. Johnson with what he achieved in civil rights, Ronald Reagan with all that he achieved, managed, in the case of Ronald Reagan, without a majority in Congress most of the time, without even a majority in the Senate most of the time, to create successful change and successful coalitions that bought into what he wanted to do. So with strong leadership, the Constitution can work.
I would say that strong leadership must be paired, as it was for all of those presidents, although Reagan least and sort of LBJ somewhere in the middle, with weak parties. What we have now is relatively strong for the United States, ideologically sorted, and that's the important part, political parties. In the 1930s, probably somewhat of an unusual example because of the unusual domestic circumstances. In the 1960s, even in the 1980s, it was possible to assemble bipartisan governing coalitions, even with Reagan and some Democrats, because it was not true that every single member of the Democratic Party was to the left of every single member of the Republican Party. You had conservative Democrats in the southern United States. You had more liberal Republicans up in the northern United States. And so it was possible to, without compromising party interest in the way that it would be now, to forge governing coalitions in a bipartisan way. That is no longer true because the hydraulic effects of the United States States political system have worked themselves out so completely that now the parties are ideologically uniform to a much greater degree. And so as a result, if any of them occupy any of the many veto points that exist in the American system, they can very effectively and do very effectively use that to stop anything that the governing party that has won the most recent election would really like to do in any kind of fundamental way.
But isn't that actually the virtue of the system, that when politics in the US becomes deeply ideological, this is a constraint? And it is one of the weaknesses of the United Kingdom, that if you have a strongly ideological political party, it can change things very rapidly without taking full account of the minority. And so the US is very good at protecting the rights of the minority under its constitutional settlement.
That is true. That is true that we are. But what I would say is that whether that's a virtue really depends on the external circumstances. And I would think that the people who should be able to decide whether it is a virtue to make large change or small change at a given moment, and even the people who should be able to decide, well, how far should the protections for minority or dissenting voices extend, should be ultimately the people themselves. Right? There is no neutral answer to that question. There is no sort of platonically or mathematically correct amount of change that it is good to inhibit. The right amount of that is a political question and has to be settled in a democracy politically. We have no mechanism to do that. And more importantly, we have no mechanism to change over time. Perhaps it was true that for a large portion of our history, a huge number of veto points was appropriate. Perhaps it was true then that for some other portion of our history, it would be good to have a smaller number of veto points. For example, the role of judicial review in American legislation has really exploded over the last, 40 or 50 years. This is not exactly a baked in feature of the American system, but we lack reliable mechanisms to change that over time. That is the real weakness of our status as with this constitution that is very hard to change, is even when there is overwhelming need, overwhelming desire to change those basic rules on how much change should be possible, how quickly, we lack a mechanism to do that. So we are simply stuck with this path-dependent result that we have, which might match the circumstances that we find ourselves in as a nation, but there is no guarantee that it will, and certainly it will not always match them over time.
And, of course, the authors of the Constitution were themselves quite nervous of democracy and of pure democracy, and set up an electoral college for the presidency that was meant to constrain democracy. And how worried are you about the situation, which obviously happened with Donald Trump, when the victorious candidate actually gets a minority of the public vote? Or does that represent the fact that you are the United States of individual states who have their own rights within the presidential competition?
Well, I suppose that depends on what you mean by worried. I mean, it is the case that both of the last two Republican presidents, for example, have entered office with minorities of the popular vote, and that did not seem to impede their ability to, exercise the office of president of the United States, govern, appoint Supreme Court justices, and so on. It has not been since 1992 with George H.W. Bush that a Republican president in the United States entered office with a majority of the popular vote. However, that difference has been widening. And there is something, I think, fundamentally concerning about that, because although it is true that the authors of our Constitution were skeptical of democracy, the people themselves in the United States were not and are not. And over time, there have been further and further concessions to that reality. Our senators used to be selected by state legislators. That's not true anymore. We directly elect them ever since the early part of the 20th century, and so on. Eventually, it does become somewhat concerning if you have repeated instances of minority government, where you have a majority of the United States population distributed, yes, all over the country in various states, but there's a lot of motion between states and so on. If you have reliable minorities governing in ways that they need to protect, then they will do things to ensure that that minority rule is more agreeable or more possible for them. They will change the voting rules. They will change the districting rules. They will appoint justices who are agreeable to a certain sort of minority rule political program. Over the long term, that is not sustainable for any kind of real democracy. You have to, the majority must, even if it takes a while, eventually be able to get its way. And if we are in a situation, as I think that we are flirting with, where that is not true, then that is also a recipe for real instability. If you tell a majority of a country of 300 or 350 million people, you can't get your way no matter what you do, then what they will start to wonder is, well, do you mean at least not peacefully? Because people that are frustrated for long enough will become eventually willing to explore, unsavory means of getting their way. And that is not good. That is what democracy is supposed to channel our energies away from.
And that leads on to one of, I think, the biggest weakness in the US Constitution. Ours in the UK is too easy to change, yours too difficult. But the consequence of that is that the ultimate arbiters of law are the judges rather than democratically elected politicians. And it seems to me, from a few thousand miles away, that has politicized the judiciary in a way that undermines confidence in the independence of the judiciary. Is that a fair criticism, or am I being too harsh?
I think it is a fair criticism, and it is a process that has been working itself out over the last, 30, 40, 50 years. It is unusual, to say the least, to have any government official, as judges do in the United States, serve for life. Judges in the United States serve for terms of, quote, good behavior, which means they serve for life unless they're impeached and removed, which is very, very difficult. It is unusual to have any public official serve a life tenure, especially in a democracy like the United States, which doesn't have titles of nobility and so on. But it is really unusual to have those people then be responsible for answering some of the most major questions of public policy that we have in the United States. Will there be same-sex marriage, for example, is a question that was not answered by the United States Congress, was not answered by the president, but was answered by a set of justices at the Supreme Court who had been selected in some cases decades beforehand under contingent circumstances that had nothing to do with the present moment. Whether there will be the death penalty, whether we will have the Affordable Care Act and universal health insurance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Border policy in the United States. Who will determine the Texas border policy? The governor of Texas or the president of the United States? For some reason, the Supreme Court will answer that question. And of course, as my old boss, Justice Scalia, used to remark, if what the people thought that these justices were doing was just making neutral legal decisions up there, perhaps they would leave them alone. But if they think they are going to be asked to answer fundamental questions of value, there is no legal answer to is abortion right or wrong, for example. That is a values question. If they get the sense that our justices are going to be answering values questions, then they're going to get the sense that the values of the people themselves are just as good as anything taught in Yale Law School or Harvard Law School, and perhaps even better. And so they're going to insist that these officials represent their values just as any democratically elected or appointed official would. And that will tend to inevitably drive an ideological and partisan polarization of the judiciary. And the problem is, maybe that's fine for abortion. That in the abortion cases, you'll have a sort of third order kind of democracy on the question. It doesn't really satisfy anybody, but at least you could sort of defend it in the process. But those exact same people decide all of the cases. Those exact same people decide issues of criminal procedure and administrative law and so on. And now you've got a set of courts and a set of judges who were selected for essentially political value reasons that are supposed to be answering neutral legal questions. And the spillover from one to the other is going to inevitably cause people's confidence or the idea of legitimacy in these courts to decline over time. It is not good for the courts. It is not good for us to have these people in that role. I do not even think they really enjoy being in that role all that much. But that is the situation that we find ourselves in with no real way to get out of it, at least not anything that people are willing to contemplate just yet.
Because it's too difficult to amend the Constitution, and therefore it was, wasn't it, Chief Justice Marshall who gave this power, took this power for the court in the early 19th century, and they are the inheritors of that today.
Yes, exactly. Took it from his political rivals in, post-war, early post-revolutionary America. Yes, exactly. We can't amend the Constitution to get rid of judicial review. We could pass legislation limiting the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court or setting limits on the kinds of cases that it could decide. But of course, that legislation itself would be subject to judicial review, and who knows what the court would say. Yeah, exactly. And so even though it's not a situation,
in the UK, an act of Parliament is supreme and cannot be overruled by any court. So we have it a little bit easier here as a British politician. Thank you so much for joining me. That really has been the most interesting conversation. Ian Samuel, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.